That was a great fade, Emma. Emma and I have been working on our DJ skills, the fade out. Emma Wergely's, I want to say, has been captaining our ship and running the admin side of this just as a service to us, as she's had some time off, but is heading off to a new job, an exciting job where she's going to be working on policy, transportation policy. In DC, I think. Yeah, the East Coast. But anyway, so congrats to Emma, who has a lot more to give than running this Zoom. But I'm so grateful for all that you've helped us with, and this class will be her last. So, okay. Hello. I'm so happy to be back. I'm so happy to be with, I'm grateful that people still show up, you know, like I fear that you take a couple of weeks off and like everybody forgets you. So really good to be back in the Parsha. You know, we had that 1 week where there was no Parsha because of Passover. And then last week was Yom HaShoah and we had special programming. So we just kind of took it as a break in the schedule. And it was nice to have a break, but it's really nice to be back. And, you know, I want to give us a little bit of a orientation to where we're at, which is right in the heart of Leviticus, right? Smack in the middle of Leviticus, and actually pretty close to the middle of the Torah itself. And you know, like I've been saying this. We studied a few parshas of Leviticus already, and I've been saying that Leviticus is some people just outright don't like it, but even if you have found an ability to appreciate Leviticus, it's certainly the hardest, most difficult book of the Torah to read. You know, it's just dense and difficult reading, and I've been suggesting that because of that, because it is so hard, and yet it is part of it's 1/5 of our Chumash, of our 5 books, and so it's we have to treat it as this sacred thing, and so we have to figure out a way to love it, and so we try harder and we read harder, and we we turn it into this most sacred thing because it's the Torah, so it has to be holy. And after all, Leviticus is about holiness. Leviticus, that's its obsession, is creating a holy space. And what happens in the holy space, in the Holy of Holies, is that one encounters God in that space. That's the idea. And so this is a book about intimacy, right? This is a book about closeness. Korbanot are we say the offerings, but the things that bring us close is the language in Hebrew. So intimacy with God, and that's a crazy thought because we also believe that God is intangible and unknowable. So how do you have intimacy with God? Well, you know, one of Leviticus's answers seems to be that you have to have rules. You have to have lots and lots of rules, and you have to have boundaries, and you have to have details, and you have to have categories, and it's a science, the science of closeness to God, of coming close to God. And so that's gives us a little bit of a sense where we're at. We're in the middle of that dense science, and in particular, we're coming just off the heels of the last parsha, which was Shmini, where we got the first overview of the kosher laws. Okay, the keeping kosher is detailed in full at the end of Parshat Shmini. And now we head into Parshat Tazria, and the first thing that we're looking at there is the rituals, rites and rituals, purity rituals around birth. Okay, so that's where we're at. Like and there's a lot, and that is to say that where we're at is we're in the laws of purity and impurity. I must always say that those words are not the perfect translation of tahor and tameh. There are these two categories, and when you're in one state, pure, let's say, and I like pure as opposed to clean and unclean or other things like, because I feel like pure is pretty mysterious also. but whatever pure is, tahor is being in a state where you can approach the offerings and make an offering to God. You're in a state where you can be intimate with God. And tameh, or impure, and I know it has a heavy, like, negative connotation. So, and maybe it's meant to, and maybe it's not. I don't want to be an apologist before we figure it out, but like, you can't go to the offerings when you're in a state of impurity. Okay, so laws around what you can eat to be in a state of impurity, and that's the kosher laws, and then laws around what happens when one's body is in a state of crisis or vulnerability, and that's tazria and mitzora, and we learn about, you know, skin afflictions and genital emissions and rashes and birth and death and all of the things that bring out the kind of the fluid, the kind of the guk in us, are considered. Do they or do they not render us into a state of impurity? Now, okay, you know what? talking. All right, let's get into the material. That was an orientation, and you know, it's like you begin to give an introduction and you start introducing everything in the world. Okay, so let's say a blessing to bring us back into this space of studying our holy Torah. It is the beginning of the month of Iyar. It is we counted yesterday the 18th day of the Omer. It's we're journeying between Passover and into Shavuot. It's an auspicious moment. So let's bless this moment. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so I played that Leonard Cohen song at the outset because of that refrain that's become so famous. He's such a poet, Leonard Cohen, one of our poets, you know, the Hebrew poets, so to speak. And the refrain that's become so famous is, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, and that's, you know, the crack is good. Things that have a little crack. Anyway, I just kept thinking of this image, and I don't know, I'm kind of repurposing it, but I kept thinking of this image because the space that I was just describing between last week's Parsha Shemini and this week's Parsha Tazria is like I said, we're right in the heart, in the middle of these purity and impurity laws, very dense and to a certain extent very difficult, like not just to read, but difficult to admire. They seem to clinicize and objectify the human body and experience and form, and you know, there's a lot of ugh in it. But there, in that space between one parsha and the other, there's a crack, right? And shining through that crack are all of these beautiful midrashim, these rabbinic legends that were sort of composed alongside the Talmud. These midrashim right here in this place in the Torah of all places are some of the most beautiful midrashim you will ever see. And we're going to look at two of them today and try to think about what it is that the rabbis are doing when they try to love Leviticus, when they try to find deep, beautiful, rich, flowing meaning in these dense little laws that they've inherited. And there's real light shining through, and it turns out to be the light of Genesis. Okay? All right, so we're gonna like make those connections. I see that Kathy Kobayashi is here with us today. Thank God, because Kathy Kobayashi is like our Genesis master, is always tethering us back to Genesis, and she's following in a tradition. There's a certain kind of tradition of like seeing the Torah and trying to hear echoes of previous Torah, and so like the most echoes are in Genesis, of course. I mean, the thing most echoed, just if you give the Torah enough span, is the first thing. Okay. All right. I have certainly been talking long enough. Here is our source sheet for today. Now, before we get to the light, let's take a look at not the dark, but the text itself, the actual moment that I'm talking about between these two parshas, where all this midrashim is flowing through. And as I said, it's a movement from the laws of keeping the laws of keeping kosher. This is the end of last week's Parsha Shmini, and it ends These are the instructions concerning animals, birds, all living creatures that move in water, and all creatures that swarm on earth, for distinguishing between the impure and the pure. There are those words, tameh here and tahor. Okay, impure and pure, between the living things that may be eaten and the living things that may not be eaten. Okay, that's the end. That's the summary. We have just been reviewing the laws of keeping kosher. And in fact, it's not the laws or the instructions. In fact, the word in Hebrew is zot Torat. This is the Torah of. And I want us to see that it doesn't read as well when he says this is the Torah of the animals and the birds and all living creatures, but actually let's keep that language in there. This is the Torah of, right, animals, birds, and all of that, because that's really the language there. And we'll see that language pop up again, and it'll be important to us. So the same word that we use to describe the whole book is also a word that means teaching or instruction. Okay, and that's why Torah can be used to mean more than that. We actually use it casually. Just we're studying Torah right now, whatever we're studying in our tradition, the teaching. Okay, so that's the end of that. That's the kashrut laws. And then we get into Parsha Tazria. And Tazria is named for this word here, conceives. And again, I need to do a little bit of translation reworking here. So let's read a little bit first, and then we'll stop and translate. The Eternal spoke to Moses saying, this is the beginning of this week's Parsha. The Eternal spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people thus, when a woman conceives and bears a male, she shall be impure 7 days. She shall be, oh, I meant to retranslate all these. Impure, not unclean. Impure, sure, I'll make it public. Impure as at the time of her menstrual impurity, right? So menstruation, blood also creates a state of impurity, as most of the fluids that emit from the genitals do. And okay, so let's just stop there. This giving birth to a male creates a state of impurity, or tuma. There's that word here, tuma, titma, right there. Okay, this word here, I just want to give us the full feeling of this word before I start opening it up for analysis. That word, it could be conceives, and I actually think that the Sepharia translation was when a woman is in childbirth, but that loses all sense of it. It really is more like gestates, and the word is related to the word for seed. So it's almost like germinates. Okay, like the echo is almost of like the language of planting or seeding. So, but it is, I think, in its context, conceives. When a woman forms, conceives, produces the new life, the thing that will be a embryo, a fetus, and then gives birth. Then those are two stages. But the Parsha is named for this word, when a woman conceives, and we'll be thinking about that word and that moment a lot. Okay, let's just read the rest of it. Then the Torah almost jumps in and gives us a circumcision rule. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. I think biblical critics see this line as inserted, right? So just FYI, she shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. Okay, she shall not touch any consecrated thing. So she doesn't come and make offerings for the first 33 days, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. If she bears a female, she shall be impure 2 weeks as during her menstruation, and she will remain in a state of blood purification for 66 days. So this actually last year, if you studied with us last year, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck, why is there a double period of waiting when you give birth to a female child? Okay. So okay. On the completion of her period of purification, for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest. And I'm using the words as we're in a period, obviously, of reconceiving and of all kinds of like gender questions, including the assignment of gender at birth, right? So, but I'm just going to follow the words, the most common translation I could offer for ben o bat, son or daughter, and zachar o lenakeva, male and female. That's, we can consider that, but just calling that out. On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. So there is the sin offering probably is rings. What kind of sin offerings do get offered a lot? They were actually offered for the inauguration of the Mishkan itself, but one also has to wonder what it's doing here. And now you see after this period, she is once again in a state where she can approach the altar and make an offering. In fact, she's commanded to. And then the priest shall offer it before the Eternal and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be pure from her flow of blood. Such are the instructions for one who bears a child, male or female. And such are the instructions. You remember what that is in Hebrew? Zot Torat. This is the Torah. This is the Torah of childbirth. This is the Torah of childbirth. That was the Torah of keeping kosher. This is the Torah of childbirth. Okay. And they both have to do with purity or impurity. All right, we're about to head in to see these midrashim, which is really our work today. But we've just so far taken a look at the text. I don't want to just blow by a text that's about like birth and bodies and all without at least giving us some space to respond to it. So I don't have a pointed question, but does anyone have any reactions so far, either to the placement, like the juxtaposition of the kosher, or just to the laws themselves? Anybody want to just react and make sure certain ideas are in on the floor as we head in? I saw Julia's hand first.
Yeah, I'm really thinking about the words for tameh and tahor, and also how similar tam is. Obviously, it's with a different letter. It's with taf, but that it means unblemished. And it seems like these states of being are so delicate, and really anything can kind of knock you out of tahor or and into tameh, and that tam just seemed this like idea of being unblemished. It's like so very close sounding to tameh, and it makes me think back to the Machiavelli class that you were teaching about how Jacob was an ish tam, and he was like so afraid of becoming this trickster, and like it so easily turned into what he became in his life. And I don't know if we want to put tameh on him, but he certainly was tam, and by the end of his life was not necessarily.
Okay, that's really interesting. First of all, now Julia admits there's a problem with that kind of reading because they're different letters, but there's the same sound. The word for kind of like innocence, pure and kind of simple is tam, and the word for impurity, as we're translating it here, is tameh. But they're spelled differently. But what you're doing is midrashic. I mean, we're going to be doing midrashic work today. What you're doing is midrashic, and it's that sort of like. And after all, tamim, or an offering, also has to be tamim. Both of the words you're playing with are there in Leviticus. So it is worth, like, this is exactly the kind of reading that I want us doing, or that I think our rabbis are asking us to do, is like, just listen to the sounds and look at the patterns and try to spot just like what's happening with these words. Maybe there's more to it than just, and then 33 days later, she will offer a lamb, and it's like feels a little too clinical, right? So, but this is good reading. This is midrashic reading. All right, let's take Noah and then Kathy, and then we'll head in. Noah?
Yeah, I found a couple things interesting here. First, that it's coming immediately after Shmini with all the kosher laws, where that's telling us what we can take into our bodies, and then immediately follows Tazria Metzora with the purity laws around what's coming out of the body. So it's like taking in and giving out. And next, I'm thinking 33 days for the male child. That seems somewhat related to the Omer counting and Lag BaOmer on the 33 third day of the Omer, but it just seems what we're taking in, eating, and then what we're doing to produce life and give life to the next generation and the purity around that.
Oh my gosh, wonderful, wonderful. This is great. We're really like, I'm invited midrashic reading and I'm getting it. I mean, this is good. You know, the idea that now we have to look at these parshas symbolically. What goes into the body, what comes out of the body. Like to look at, and I don't just mean symbolically, but almost like structurally. The second interpretation you gave, I think, is even more of a stretch, you know. So, but the midrashic mind works that way. Like, what other connections? 33. Where else do I see 33? 33rd day of the Omer is a special day. The Torah must be anticipating that, or referencing that, or calling it, right? This is midrashic thinking, and you know there are always questions of the limits of midrashic thinking, but this is definitely we're in the zone. Okay, one more thought, and then I want us to look at an actual piece of midrash from Kathy Kobayashi.
I just feel compelled to say something. I'll try to be brief because this really is one of my favorite Torah portions. And it's actually related to one of my favorite essays, which is in the first Jewish catalog on Tameh and Tahor by Rachel Adler. And it was, anyway, probably the first Jewish book I ever read. But anyway, it's really talking about impurity and purity as being this sort of dealing with the nexus between life and death. That these are all, or mostly, situations where it could go either way, life or death, and that's dealing with that kind of really frightening, dangerous sorts of, as she says, kind of the nexus. Are times when you then go through this process. And so anyway, I
love that offering, Kathy. And in fact, not just love it, I too, if we were just going to drill down on what is Tameh and Tahor, is it clean and unclean, pure and impure? I think that interpretation resonates most strongly with me as well, that it is a closeness to states of death or vulnerability, or a closeness to states of life and vitality. And they do think, and contact with the dead, and flaky skin or emissions from our body, like all of the things that seem to betray the solid composition of our living being are like more tameh. And birth is an incredibly vulnerable state where, you know, one is wide open and the child is in a vulnerable state. So I tend to agree with that interpretation. You want to add one last thought?
Yeah, one more thought though, but also this, well, the whole, you know, connection to menstruation and everything like that. And I guess my sort of feeling about it is, yes, it's sort of, there's a lot of focus on women, but I think it's because they thought that women were scary. Dangerous, you know, that there's a kind of a fear of women. And you think of childbirth and menstruation and things like that as being pretty, you know, sort of powerful things. So I know it does put women in this kind of position that could be seen as trying to control women. But I think it's coming. Yeah, I really feel like it's coming.
Good. Thank you for mentioning that also, right? It's hard today not to read these texts and think about the way that they seem to like participate in a kind of an objectification, a gaze at women's bodies and the intricacy of women's bodies. And I'm sure a lot of us are wondering who wrote these texts anyway, right? So, and that can go either way. It can be a kind of critique of the text, as if to say, look at the way that women's bodies are scary and full of blood. It can also be just a way of making meaning of like all this entire society trying to work through, you know, the differences between bodies and birth and trying to figure, you know. So, okay, so I think that's important to have in the air as well. Whatever is that all that stuff and the potential for critique and discomfort with this text, all that being present, suddenly you turn to the commentaries and you get like a different, it makes me wonder also what were the rabbis thinking? What were they comfortable or uncomfortable with? Probably not the same discomforts that we have, but when they read these texts, what were they thinking when they read them that compelled them to add something, as you'll see, that is so that takes us to an entirely different place? Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a look at the text. Okay, first we're just going to look at Rashi, our most famous commentator, who provides us with one of the midrashim, and that we're going to look at today. And this in itself is a beauty. So Rashi's job, self-appointed, is to kind of cull through the previous canon of rabbinic literature and try to pick the interpretation that he thinks best helps us read this piece of the text. And Rashi, I think, is going to be dealing with an issue that we too have been dealing with, which is, or at least I've kind of foregrounded, which is what is the movement between keeping kosher and then suddenly birth? Why this order? So Rashi says an incredible thing. Rashi says, Amar Rabbi Simlai. Rabbi Simlai said, Kashem sheyitzirato shel adam achar kol behema chaya va'of b'maseh bereshit, kach torato nitparsha achar torat behema chaya va'of. Rabbi Simlai said, just as the formation of the human took place after that of every cattle, beast, and fowl in the creation of the world, so too the Torah of the human being is given after the Torah of the cattle, beast, and fowl. Okay, so let's just be clear on what he's doing here. He's saying, just like when we look back at the book of Genesis, here your next source is the book of Genesis, and we see that on the fifth day God created swarming things and birds and little fish, birds, and insects. Basically, God created on the fifth day, and then on the sixth day God created, yes, eventually human beings, but first cattle and creeping things and wild beasts of every kind, and then created finally, last thing on the sixth day. This would be a little more elegant. I'm always surprised that the Torah includes on the sixth day both cows and human beings, but okay. But anyway, the point is the human beings are created the last here after all the animals, and so too the Torah of animals, although in this case not the creation of but the eating of, and the Torah of humans, and in this case not the first formation, but yes, a new formation of a new human being is in the same order. Animal stuff first, and then human stuff. Okay, and I told you we were going to take note of these words earlier. Let's also notice that Rabbi Simlai is playing on the language of this is the Torah of the animals, and this is the Torah of childbirth, right? Zot Torat. So when he says that, just like the formation of the person or of the animal precedes the formation of the person, so the Torah of the animal precedes the Torah of the person. Same, parallel. Okay. Now I think that's cool. I said I think that's cool, but why is it cool? What does it mean? Why? I think I've helped. I think I've kind of given you some of the scaffolding here for understanding what it explains in the text and the movement, and you pretty much, I guess we understand now what he's saying. Just like back then, same order here. But who cares and why? And what is this? What does he say? What is actually saying? Okay. I'll take questions now. Florine, I know you had a comment from before. Is it now a good time or not?
It's okay. I wanted to comment on something Kathy said. I totally agree with her. I believe that when the placenta is inside the woman, it has a life. When the placenta is ejected, it's death. When a woman has menstruation, her seed goes bye-bye. In other words, she doesn't conceive, and that's a kind of death. And so I believe that this is all a grieving process. that we go through in this Torah portion.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna tether that back to the last, like another way of thinking about those laws. And we can be. I want to put a pause on thinking too deeply right now about the actual childbirthing or kosher laws, because right now the Midrash is asking to pan way back and just think about the thinking of animals and their laws and their purity laws, and then thinking about humans and their, because the Midrash is doing that. Midrash is just making it about the human being. Right? So what's happening? What is the Midrash? Why does it can be an aesthetic comment on the structure, way the Torah tells its story, or could it be something more philosophical or something more ontological? Like, what does it mean to say that the Torah structures its teachings in accordance with the creation of the world? Okay. I don't know who raised hands first, but Esra.
Okay, hi. It's good to be here. And I was thinking that maybe there might be something here about like order of priority, kind of like humans knowing our place. And so we're meant to learn that, look, Torah instructs, us to live our life in ways with structure and boundaries. And so in the same way that there was a structure and kind of boundaries around what gets created first and what gets created next, same about how to live with the things that were created. So this is kind of like, maybe, we need to first think about the creatures we live in harmony, these animals that actually came before us, and kind of boundary our own relationships with those animals and how we eat them and what we do. And then also boundarying our own kind of relationships to ourselves and what we do after we were going through these transitional liminal phases. Again, Torah is instructing and trying to give a structure for things that have that liminal in between space. Some states are clearly defined, some are less so. So that was one thought. And then I had another thought and I forgot what it was. Okay.
Your one thought is enough, is a lot to digest. And I very much appreciate it. This was making for us some sense. It's not just order, like order follows order, do it the same way you did it before, but there's something about the order that's important for us to pay attention to. And there are other midrashim, not the one I brought today, but clearly that speak this out even clearer, the value that Esther's articulating. That there's something about this order that suggests you weren't first. You weren't first. You don't come first. It's not always about you. First, like maybe actually think about how you treat the animal kingdom, right? Takes because God thought of the animals first. So order as primacy. And by the way, of course, we could read that the other way and be like, we, as has been read many times, we are the culmination of creation. Look, first God made all the little crappy things, and then God made us, right? Like that also is a form of order as primacy. Okay, Marianka.
Could we say that we're talking here about a creation of a new nation and a nation that has a new relationship with God? So in Exodus, we have the birth, the separation of the waters, just as in Bereshit, the waters separated and theirs came out. Here, the nation comes out through the birth canal, the separation of the waters. And now the repeat of the same order, things that deal with animals first and humans, it's because it's a kind of, because it's another creation, like I said, creation of a nation, and a nation that has a new relationship with God.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's all I have to say.
Marianka, that's all you have to say, but that's like a bomb. It's like through a great, beautiful explosion into the room, because that idea that birth is a thing that happens to some human beings, but well, I guess happened to all of us at one point, right? And it happened too. But birth is also one of the central metaphors that we are working with throughout all of the Torah story. And Exodus is seen as the birth of a new nation. And the world is then a birth. God births the world, right? There's a way in which I think this midrash is already asking us to think of childbirth as a new creation, right? It's God created the human being. This woman creates a new human being. There's a new creation. It's a parallel to, it's not like just the order, it's creation itself. There's a new kind of creation going. Now, it's a midrash, so it's loose, right? Just like some of our interpretations at the outset were loose, like seeing a pattern. We don't create the food, that doesn't hold all the way through, but we do. There is a note of creation here, and as we parallel read it to creation, we start to imbue this moment of birth with a sense of, this is like the formation of the first human, right? And we reenact God's final act, right, through birth, right? And then we take that, or actually it probably goes the other way. That is such a powerful experience that we read that as a metaphor onto so many other things. Anything that comes into being is being birthed, so to speak. Okay. All right, Yonatan.
There's a comment in the chat that I really feel the need to bring into the conversation by a person I don't know, and so I'm sorry if I pronounce the name wrong, but Dej says, what would a human being be without a red heifer? Which is just this, I find to be incredibly clever in terms of, you had I'm kind of taking the second school of thought as far as purpose goes, right? That animals were created to make the way for humans, to make human life possible, right? And that the story of the Torah does that in a way that's literal and corporeal. And then this commentary comes in to say, well, that's spiritually true as well, right? That the laws of the sanctification of animals are a predecessor to the law of sanctification of people. That there's a buildup, that creation happens in a progression that is ever growing and ever increasing. And I do feel obligated to put one caveat on that, which I've done before in your classes, that is, we in our modern minds tend to think purity good, impurity bad, right? And part of that is that there's not a great translation for Tameh and Tahor, but like, practically speaking, that's really not true, like especially for women, unless they were the daughters of a Kohen, there was like 0 ramifications to being impure. And even back in biblical times, like almost everyone was impure almost all the time, and now we're all impure all the time. Like I don't buy as much into the like impurity bad paradigm, but even with that in mind, that's kind of the trajectory, I think, the source.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't buy into that, then you're welcome to class, because I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like it's like we're trying to figure out a way to not read this text as just like the good and the bad and the holy and the unholy. Like in some ways, I think you're exactly right to be reacting to that. I also I'm wondering if it isn't just modern, if the rabbis too were like, this is too clinicized and binary, and there's magic going on here. And anyway, that's an aside. As to your Torah, I think, and not yours, and Dages, right? You want to pronounce it for us? Yeah, Dages. Both of your Torah, right? There's this way in which now we're being given the tools by the Torah. Is this reading suggests to recreate the world, like the Mishkan is like the beginning of like creating a world for God to exist in. And so we have to go through the motions of recreating the world and retracing the steps and sanctifying the world. And this is some of the language that Yonatan used. And that's right. We go through and create Kedusha, sanctification. How do we sanctify our relationship to light? How do we sanctify our relationship to water? How do we sanctify our relationship to earth? How do we sanctify our relationship to animals? How do we sanctify our relationship to our own bodies, to ourselves, to our coming into being, right? And then Shabbat, right? So like we go through, and after all, we rest on Shabbat as God rested on the seventh day. What a weird thing. So that parallel's already like that. That parallel exists almost inherently in the story. Right? All right, Matt Silverstein, and then I want to turn to this second midrash.
Just a quick little thing, because we're talking about going back to Genesis and stuff. There's a midrash that God created the Torah first, that the Torah is primary, and that the world was created to fulfill the Torah. And so I just see an echo of that in this. You know, there's this teaching that matters. Now we're going to do the stuff. We're going to go through that and through that order to make that real. Anyway,
Good. That's really good. First of all, I want to just say, I've been thinking about it since I said I didn't mean that as snarky as it sounded, Jonathan. Welcome to class. I just meant like, indeed, we are on exactly. So there was nothing snarky intended. Matt, that's exactly right, and you are echoing for us this idea that the world was a kind of playing out of the Torah. This is a midrash also in Bereshit. It's not the other one we're going to look at today, but just wanted to give it because the midrash we read so kicks it up, and Matt really intuits this, that God looked into the Torah and created the world. So that the Torah
I didn't read ahead. I hadn't read ahead.
No, that's great. The idea is the Torah is the blueprint for the world, right? And I'm not sure actually if our midrash is saying that like our midrash almost seems to be saying the opposite, like the Torah is structured on the structure of the world, whereas this midrash is like, no, the world is structured on the structure of the Torah, right? So either way, there's some sort of like parallel structure, and perhaps one is learning from the other. I mean, the one we just read and what Matt said is kind of wild, because it suggests sort of paradoxically that God opened the Torah and said, oh, I should create a world. It says to do so right here, Bereshit bara Elokim. And that's actually what the midrash says. God opens the Torah and says, oh, God created the world? Well, then I'll do that. And then like created Adam and Eve and whatever. Okay, so great stuff. But maybe like these are already incredible midrashim that we're looking at, but I don't even think this is that we've even scratched the surface. The most mind-blowing midrash, both in terms of its narrative, but also its placement here. And it's one I think I've studied with this group before, so some of you may see this coming, but they're in this, the same midrash that Rashi quoted. Let's take a look here now. Rashi quoted for us, I'm going to scroll back here, Leviticus Rabbah. Rabbah is just a name for the most classic collection of midrashim. So the classic collection of Vayikra, of Leviticus, has this piece, and Rashi quoted it. Now let me go show you where it is. It's in 14:1. I'll go show you where it is. So here it is, Vayikra Rabbah 14:1. Now the way the midrash works is when a woman conceives is the heading, as if to say we're going to be riffing on this language or this moment or this place in the Torah. And as you can see, there's lots of riffing. And we're not looking at all of them today. The first, we're going to play a little bit with a verse in Psalms that speaks about creation. And then all the way at the end is this Rabbi Simlai that Rashi quoted, which means, and this should help us understand if you're new to Rashi, part of what Rashi does. This is what Rashi's commentary is about. Rashi scrolls through on the internet here. Rashi looks up in Safari and scrolls through no, just kidding. He just knew all of the Torah by heart. But Rashi, it was a different time. Rashi looks at all these midrashim and says, oh, I'm going to pick this one as a commentary. This is the one I think is most relevant and most important, the one he gave us. But if you scroll back, we have the appearance of one of, I think, the most important and kind of complex and paradigm-shattering midrashim that we have, which is this. And remember, it's a comment on this moment of birth, right? And we've already seen they're reaching back to Genesis. So we looked at the 5th day of Genesis and the 6th day of Genesis, and now we're thinking about the formation of the human being. And so Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says the following. We're right here. Oops. Here I am. Sorry. This is my one frustration with Safari is the clicking up and down thing, which I haven't mastered. Okay. Said Rav Shmuel Bar Nachman, the Holy Blessed One, when creating the first human being, created it as an androgynous. Androgynous. I'm not saying androgynous because I'm not sure. I'm using their category, androgynous, because this is a rabbinic category. The rabbis had 4 primary gender categories and some other subcategories. And one of the gender categories was androgynous, which simply put is someone who displays both male and female physical character traits. Okay, it's both. So androgynous. When the Holy Blessed One, when creating the first human being, Adam. Who was Adam? Adam. Adam was androgynous, not a male or a female, but an androgynous. Reish Lakish said, adding on that teaching, Reish Lakish said, when it was created with 2 faces, and then it was split so that it has 2 backs. One back was male, and one back was female. Okay? So are we getting this? The first person was like what we would think of as 2 people, one of whom was male and one of whom was female, facing outward. That was the first person, right? This is a male face and this is a female face or whatever. But, more to the point, body parts. And then God split that in half. And now there are 2. Now, Midrash is always responding to something in the text. They're not just making this stuff up, meaning they may be making this stuff up, but they're not just coming up with, I want to say this now. There's something in the text that they're responding to. And in this case, some of you may anticipate this or know it. The thing that, we already looked at Genesis, so it's up this way. Remember that when God said, now let us make the human being in our image after our likeness, they shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. Here, I'm going to make this a little bigger. All the living things that creep on the earth. And God created the human in God's image. In the image of God, this is Tselem Elohim, this is big language. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. That's really important. And in fact, I almost want to, it's probably better, both for my own sensibilities, but if that's it. And in the image of God, God created it, the person, male and female, God created them. But whatever it is, whether it's him or it, I'm going to turn it back to him just because that's the classic rendering of this gender pronoun. But there's something happening in the text where it's singular, but also plural, and the plural is both male and female. And so the rabbis say that we have to figure that out. I have to figure that out. What does that mean? It must mean that Adam was male and female, both. But then we later have 2. Well, they were split apart. Okay. And if I may, just because this is like, I think, suffice this to say, I think part of what's important about this is that it breaks gender paradigms and also doesn't place the male being created first. I think that's a really important kind of moment, although we can push back on it, fine, we can, but I think that's important. But before I get carried away with thinking that's important, my second question would be, and I'm sure what about the rib? What about Adam's rib? Wasn't she taken as, she's just a little part of Adam, right? It wasn't that way. What about that story? Because in chapter 2, there's a different story. And of course, the Midrash did not miss this. So take a look at this. This is just really, I think, important just for those of us who identify as feminist readers of the text. So just an important thing to take a look at here, that that they challenged his interpretation. What do you mean the first person was created male and female? Doesn't it say, and God took one of his ribs? It says that later, doesn't it? Tsela is the word for ribs, slaotav. And then he responded and said, no. That's not God took one of his ribs, but one of the sides, one of his sides, his whole sides. and there's a proof text for it. It's not just, oh, I prefer this reading, but it's written when we construct the tabernacle, we use the same word, uletzela hamishkan, and to the side of the tabernacle. Meaning it can mean ribs, but that's just because this means the side of a person. And you may not buy this reading, it is midrashic, but just note that the rabbis are doing this, that they're saying, no, you misunderstood if you thought it was the rib of a guy. It's this different being altogether, and right, and it was formed male and female, and then it was split apart. Right? Okay, there's lots to say here, lots to say here, but I want to at least give us some time to think about, why is this here? Does Vayikra Rabbah think that this is the moment to have us thinking about this, the creation of the person, and the creation of the person is male and female, right? So I'd love to hear, we did a lot of thinking about the parallelism just between creation and this moment in Vayikra, but now just thinking about the birth itself as the rabbis thought to remind us of the creation of the first multi-gendered person, right? Okay, Wendy, and then Jen.
There are a few things that came to mind for me, beginning with how we started today. We talked about how this is particularly the intimacy that we have with God in Leviticus. And because of that, you're talking about the blueprint. That blueprint of Torah is for us, because going back to Genesis, as we've been talking about, God creating. When God creates us to be co-creators with God from this blueprint, just as an architect, as a builder has a blueprint, and from that, the building is made, and the design, and all the colors, all of it. This is what that blueprint is for us. And each time that we come back to Torah, we hopefully can get other parts of our building that we're creating, this world that we're creating, that we are in and constantly recreating. And because of that, when Yonatan was talking about pure and impure, there isn't, that doesn't mean bad and good necessarily. One needs purity and impurity to know the difference between the two. Just as God created darkness first, we think of that, we connotate often that is something bad. But in fact, if we don't have darkness, we don't know light. And so these things that we're going through, I believe, in Leviticus, is to help us understand more and more the intricacies of this world, this physical world that we're in, because this relationship with God is beyond the physical. But this is the world that we are in, and it is connected to that other world. And that's a very wonderful dance that we are asked to be a part of in our lives.
Wendy, you're like our resident Heschel. You're like, you have such a poetic way of tying it all together. It's just so beautifully put. And I, when I was thinking of what you were talking, just this idea that perhaps from the very start, we were meant to be co-creators, is that the language of our creation, right? Think about what Wendy was saying, and remember that the language of our creation is that we're going to make the human just like us, to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky. Like, we're going to be in a place of exaltedness, dominion, and with that comes certain responsibilities. But just simply put, we're just, from the very start, this idea is we're just like God, which is a wild thing to say. If I'd be a heretic if it wasn't the actual text of the Torah, right? So yeah, Jen.
Hey, this is not at all poetic, and I have no idea where to actually go with this, but what I'm really struck by is that idea of taking these two beings that are connected back to back and then splitting them and having two separate people. and the idea of pregnancy, where you are both a single person and two people in one body that then in birth gets separated into two. And just the parallel with that in terms of even just the physicality of it. Like I said, I have no idea what to make of that, but it was really sticking in my mind.
I wish I could do like, the reactions. I wish I could just do like a little cloud, like my mind is blown right now. I've never thought of that. Never thought of that. I've taught this text a million times. I've never thought of it. And that seems so true to me. It seems so true. That's part of what's going on here is there's a splitting of two beings. Of course. That's amazing. That's amazing. It's so new to me. I don't know what to do with it like you, but wow. Of course that's part of what's happening here. Yeah, of course. There's a splitting of one being into two. And in that way, the original creation was a kind of like a template for birth, which we almost like in science class when you learn about the amoebas that split apart, like there's an aspect to us that like we create from our own bodies and beings, or women do anyway. Yeah. Wow, that was great. Thank you. I want to say one last thing, which is that if God created, I want to say two last things. One is that it is clear, some of you may know that this midrash is like, wow, this is amazing, the rabbi thought of this. And then you're like, wait a minute, didn't I read that somewhere else? And if you look on our source sheet, you'll see that the last source is from Plato's Symposium. And there's a very parallel discussion there where Aristophanes says that the human being, and it's actually mentioned in the movie Hedwig and the Angry Inch, I think, if you know that movie, but where the origin of humanity is that people were created together and they were split apart in that story because they were a threat to the gods. Right, so gods like split them apart. But strikingly, there were three versions of original humans. There was female, male, and male, right, in the Greek telling. So just putting that out there, that might be useful to some of you in your continued interpretations. But the last thing that I want to say is just that if then God split Adam into Adam and Eve, right, split them apart, or into really ish v'isha, the man and the woman. And then we must remember actually that God does a lot of splitting in the creation story, right? That's one of the primary verbs, la'havdil ben orlu u'lechoshech, right? God divides the upper waters from the lower waters, the light from the dark, the male from the female. This is like sort of like God is doing all this kind of like splitting of things into categories, into parts, into multiplicity. And if that's true, that is actually a lot of what Leviticus is also doing, right? So Leviticus is actually, and with all of its attendant discomfort, there's a kind of like parsing and splitting. And in fact, and I'll just end on this, take a look at the language that we find just way up at the top. We looked at the sort of conclusion here of this is the Torah of keeping kosher, but some of the more flourished language is, for I, the Eternal One, am your God, you shall sanctify yourselves to be holy, for I am holy. You be like me. You shall not make yourselves impure through any swarming thing that moves upon the earth. For I, the Eternal One, am the one who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. We're both holy together. And then, so these are how do you be holy? These are the instructions with all the things that the animals for distinguishing between the impure and the pure. Lahavdil ben hatameh uven hatahor. And between the things that may be eaten and between the living things that may not be eaten. In other words, Leviticus is doing this dividing work. Leviticus is kind of like turning the great unity of creation into these like distinct little things with all their laws and rules, and then we're left to kind of sit and figure them all out. But there's something secret going on here. There's something wondrous going on here. There is an echo of creation itself here in the midst of these sort of dense and arcane laws. So we've done a little unearthing of that light today, and I'm grateful to you, grateful to be able to be back and learning with you, and I will see you all next week. Be well.